When did my girlfriend's parents' no dating rule completely backfire? That question kept rattling around in my head, a desperate plea for perspective in a situation that defied all logic. I was Elijah, and 2 years ago, I had been living a quiet, isolated life in Wisconsin, defined by financial spreadsheets and the perpetual feeling of being a deeply rooted anomaly. I was a secret, a 24-year-old consequence of an affair, and that reality had shaped every choice I made. I had spent months tracking him down, the man who was supposed to be my father, David Caldwell. I didn't want his money or his perfect life. I just wanted an acknowledgement, a connection. When he finally reached out, it wasn't with warmth but with a cold, calculated proposal that defied belief. He was obsessed with his flawless public image, a devout, traditional family man. My existence threatened to shatter that facade. He told me over a tense, whispered phone call that he had a solution. One that would give me legitimacy without destroying his marriage. You will be brought into the family the right way, Timothy. He had insisted, using the false name he assigned me. The plan was a twisted kind of genius, a staged courtship and marriage to his daughter, my half-sister. The air in the sterile hotel room, where we planned the charade, felt thin and poisonous. David, my father, spoke of his daughter O.P. with a strange mix of pride and clinical detachment. He described her obedience to their family's extreme, no dating until marriage rule. She is ready for this, he'd said. She wants the traditional path. This is the only way you can have a family, Elijah. My family. Desperation is a powerful narcotic. I was a man starved for connection, craving the structure and stability of the family unit David represented. He painted a picture of a life where I was finally acknowledged, finally belonged, even if the foundation was the most corrosive lie imaginable. He promised legitimacy and family, the two things my life had utterly lacked. I agreed. I accepted the name Timothy, the lie, and the objective, to marry my half-sister. The inherent wrongness of the plan was a dull, constant ache, but the yearning for David's acceptance, for a sense of rootedness, was overwhelming. I prepared to move across state lines, adopting a perfectly sanitized persona to meet the innocent young woman who was about to become the victim of my desperation and my father's cowardice. I told myself that I was the victim too. I was manipulated, forced into this bizarre role to earn my place. The alternative, remaining alone and unacknowledged, felt unbearable. I ignored the screaming moral compass inside me and instead focused on the logistics. The perfect clean-cut look and the vague backstory required to become Timothy from the Brianna family network. I was committing myself to a life built on a terrifying foundation, and I knew, deep down, there would be no clean ending. I packed my bag and drove toward the lie. The short drive across state lines had given me just enough time to internalize the shock of the plan and fully commit to the identity of Timothy. When I finally walked into the Caldwell house that Sunday, my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my exterior was the picture of clean-cut perfection. The moment I saw O.P., the gravity of the lie settled over me like a shroud. She was everything David had described, genuinely innocent, radiating a warmth that stood in stark contrast to the cold, analytical nature of our arrangement. Her eyes were bright with a cautious hope, the kind of expression worn by someone who had adhered to every rule and was finally receiving their long-promised reward. I was struck by her purity, and the guilt I felt intensified into physical nausea. David, positioned across the living room like a referee at a tennis match, monitored our every move. I was Timothy, the respectable finance analyst, and I was performing the role of a lifetime. I shook David's hand formally and called him Sir. When I shook O.P.'s hand, the contact felt charged illegal, even though it was performed under the watchful eyes of 4 parents. Our conversations were sanitized, scripted exchanges about faith, family, and future plans. Topics David had meticulously briefed me on. I spoke about wanting 4 children, a number I knew aligned perfectly with their traditional values. She spoke about wanting 3. These were not the probing, genuine exchanges of people getting to know each other, but the recitation of R.A. summaes for the role of spouse. I adopted the Timothy persona completely, mirroring David's perfect, sanitized image. The rules were absolute: twice a week, always supervised, never alone. I started developing a terrifying, genuine, and deeply conflicted affection for O.P. It wasn't love. Not yet, but a powerful draw toward her authentic nature, something that had been absent from my own life. It was a forbidden affection, a dangerous complication to a plan that was supposed to be purely transactional. The suffocating rigidity of the courtship was nearly unbearable. I realized that David's plan was designed not just to bring me into the family, but to ensure total control. He needed a relationship that had zero room for spontaneous discovery, zero opportunity for OP to scratch beneath the surface of my fabricated life. One evening after the visit, I called my mother, Angelica. She was the only person who knew I was here. Though she did not know the full extent of the plan, I couldn't bring myself to tell her I was attempting to marry my half-sister. I told her the courtship was moving too fast. I don't even know her. I admitted. Angelica just sounded tired. You wanted a father, Elijah. This is David's world. If you want his acceptance, you have to play his game. Her words provided a temporary justification, allowing me to suppress the guilt and commit further to the lie. I ignored the screaming warnings of my conscience, focusing instead on the potential reward: acceptance, stability, and, increasingly, the chance to stay near the woman who was unknowingly my sister. I told myself I could manage the guilt, that the family I gained would be worth the cost. The lie had already trapped 2 people, but I was about to ensnare a third. The wedding was set for 4 months away. I knew I couldn't stop. The wedding date was set for 4 months away, forcing the timeline into a terrifying acceleration. I knew I was meant to feel joy, but the closer the date drew, the more intense the internal dread became. I was navigating a minefield, trying to appear ecstatic while suppressing the knowledge that I was preparing to commit an act of emotional and legal violence against my own sister. I staged the proposal perfectly, down on one knee in the Caldwell living room, surrounded by both sets of parents. When OP said yes, both mothers rushed forward. Her mother hugged me and called me her son. My mother, Angelica, played the role of the proud, traditional matron of the Brianna family. I felt a surge of self-loathing so strong it nearly buckled my knees. The image of perfection we presented was a razor-sharp contrast to the corrosive truth underneath. The champagne tasted like ash. It was during the following weeks of forced proximity and planning that the cracks in the lie began to show, primarily through my own unintentional mistakes. My backstory was vague by necessity, an analytical fortress against probing questions. I had been instructed by David to use broad, sanitized language. Whenever OP would ask about my childhood, I would resort to generalizations. I grew up in the Midwest. Rather than naming a specific city, or my parents moved around for work, instead of explaining what my father did. OP, analytical herself, started noticing the patterns. She mentioned to me that I was never early for our meetings, always arriving exactly when I said I would, never suggesting we bend the rules, not even slightly. She would ask, Timothy, don't you ever want to just take a walk alone, or have a real conversation without parents hovering? This was the core of my internal conflict. I did want to break the rules, to be alone with her, to tell her the truth, or at least to date her like a normal person. But the father's control was absolute. Any deviation, any suggestion of real romantic interest that might lead to genuine intimacy, was immediately shut down. The father dismissed OP's concerns, insisting that I was merely being respectful and traditional, exactly what she wanted in a husband. His smooth defense only cemented my realization that his plan was about control and perfection above all else. One evening, I made a critical error while discussing my childhood. I said something about moving around that sounded rehearsed. OP picked up on it, asking directly, "What city exactly did you grow up in, Timothy? What kind of finance work made your father travel so much?" Her genuine curiosity was dangerous. I couldn't answer without slipping, and my hesitation was palpable. David, sensing the emergency, stepped in, placing a calming hand on OP's shoulder while staring a warning directly at me. He quickly diverted the conversation, reiterating that I was a good man from a good family, and that was all that mattered. My nervousness was not missed by OP. I could see the suspicion crystallize in her eyes, transforming her hope into a determined wariness. She was starting to scratch at the surface, driven by the knowledge that something about me felt too practiced, too perfect. David's attempt to shut down the questioning only confirmed her intuition that something was being hidden. The pressure was becoming unbearable, and I knew that the slightest shift in my performance would be enough to bring the entire facade crashing down. My subtle attempt to suggest real dating had failed, and my vagueness was actively triggering her investigation. The lie was exposed, and I had sealed my own fate. The uncomfortable silence following OP's direct questions about my past should have been my final warning. Her intuition was clearly engaged, and I knew she would not let the matter rest. I spent the next 48 hours in a constant state of anxiety, jumping every time my phone vibrated, anticipating the inevitable end of the charade. The end came not from her but from him. David Caldwell called me late Tuesday night. His voice was not the controlled, measured tone of the traditional patriarch, but a raw, frantic whisper. "She knows, Timothy. She knows you're not from the Brianna family. She called the church office. She's ruined everything." He kept repeating that she was ruining everything by not following the rules, the sheer self-absorption in his voice twisting the knife in my gut. He was terrified. I was left in an agonizing state of suspense, waiting for her to come for me. I tried to contact OP, sending a desperate, vague text about a misunderstanding, but she ignored me completely. Her silence was a far more powerful weapon than any accusation. I knew, based on the sheer volume of David's panic, that OP had confronted him directly. The father called me back an hour later. He was practically sobbing, the perfect facade completely shattered. He confessed that OP had confronted him in the garage and forced the entire truth out of him. The affair, the decades of lies, and the unbelievable incestuous plan to marry off his secret son to his legitimate daughter. The lie had fully collapsed. All my efforts, all my sacrifices had resulted in total failure. I paced my small apartment floor, the fear transforming into a profound, stomach-churning despair. My desire for a family had led me to the edge of committing something morally repugnant, and now, even that corrupt goal was gone. Then her text arrived. It was short, cold, and utterly terrifying. "Meet me Thursday afternoon at the food court in the mall, alone." This was the first time she'd asked for a private meeting, and the first time I realized how deeply I was in trouble. I didn't respond. I simply absorbed the finality of it, the chilling knowledge that she was demanding accountability. I finally called David back, shaking with fear and self-pity. He tried to rally me, to spin the situation. "We can fix this, Timothy. It's just a misunderstanding of traditional values. We can still salvage this if you stick to the story." His inability to take responsibility even now was staggering. I started talking to him, my voice breaking. I didn't know what I was saying, only that the truth, raw and ugly, needed to spill out. I apologized for going along with his insane plan, for accepting the role. In that moment of utter desperation, the scheme's full weight crushed me. I heard my own voice, strained and ragged, speaking a line that felt like the only truth left in the entire twisted saga. When did my girlfriend's parents' no dating rule completely backfire? The question was not aimed at him. It was aimed at the universe, at the profound irony that the rule designed to protect her from immorality had instead paved the way for something utterly heinous. I cried uncontrollably, the carefully constructed wall of logic and self-justification finally buckling. I had wanted a father and a family. All I had achieved was destruction. I felt an intense emotional collapse, the painful realization that I was utterly alone and complicit. I ended the call quickly, knowing that my words, though tearful and desperate, were a confession. The secondary conflict, the emotional fallout and the reckoning had begun. I had 48 hours to prepare for the meeting that would decide the fate of my life, a meeting I knew I would not survive emotionally. The 48 hours between her text and the Thursday afternoon meeting were an exercise in agony. I walked into the mall food court feeling exposed, the bright lights and the surrounding noise of 100 strangers making my shame acutely public. OP was already seated at a table near the Panda Express, and when I walked up, she didn't stand, she didn't hug me. She just looked at me with an expression of icy, contained fury. I sat down and immediately launched into my practiced apology, the one where I tried to frame myself as the father's primary victim. I started talking about how sorry I was, how I never meant for any of this to happen, and how David had promised me a family and a place to belong, preying on my lifelong loneliness. She cut me off with a sharp gesture, her voice dangerously low. "Save the excuses, Elijah. Start from the beginning. Tell me everything. When did you find out David was your father? And how the hell did you think marrying your own sister was going to work out? Her use of my real name stripped away the last remnants of the Timothy facade. I leaned forward, checking the perimeter instinctively, and began the story. I admitted I had known about David my whole life. My mother, Angelica, had told me when I was 12, showing me pictures and keeping tabs on his perfect, traditional family from afar, while I grew up in Wisconsin feeling like an outsider. I admitted I had kept pushing David for a relationship, and when he panicked, he devised the insane plan. I repeated David's twisted logic, that if I could join the family, the right way through marriage, it would be easier for everyone to accept later. I admitted that I was desperate for a father, and had convinced myself that this convoluted, destructive path was my only option. I spoke quickly, desperately trying to convey the immense pressure David had exerted. But then she asked the crucial question, the one that stopped my frantic self-justification cold. At what point in this insane plan did you realize you were being asked to marry your own half-sibling? I looked down at my hands, unable to meet her gaze. The food court noise, the clatter of trays, the children laughing, seemed distant, muffled. I admitted that David had told me from the very beginning, before we ever met. I had known the entire time. I heard her gasp, a sound that ripped through me. She lost it right there in the middle of the crowded food court. Her voice rose, laced with pure contempt. "You are just as sick as him," she hissed. "I don't care how desperate you were for a family. What kind of person agrees to marry their own sister?" She was right. In her eyes, I wasn't the desperate, manipulated son. I was the willing accomplice who had entered into a destructive agreement that benefited only me. My attempt at self-justification had failed completely, and the profound shame washed over me. I tried to reach across the table to take her hand, a gesture of pathetic desperation. She yanked her hand back so fast she knocked over her cup of water. It was a violent rejection that physically punctuated the end of our relationship. In a last, insane attempt to save the plan, or perhaps just to save my own skin, I leaned forward and whispered the most delusional thought yet. I suggested that perhaps we could still go through with the ceremony, and then get a quiet annulment later. I said David had convinced me this was the only way to avoid absolute ruin. The look she gave me then was the final nail in the coffin. It was a look of cold, hard clarity. She realized I was not some innocent victim. I was a grown man who had made a conscious choice to go along with something morally reprehensible because it benefited me. I wanted access to David, to the family's standing, to the financial legitimacy, and I was willing to destroy her life and violate a sacred trust to get it. She stood up abruptly, drawing the attention of several nearby diners. Her voice, though quieter now, carried absolute authority. "Stay away from me. Stay away from my family. If you contact me again, I will tell everyone in David's church network exactly what you tried to do." She didn't wait for a response. She turned and walked away, leaving me sitting alone amid the wreckage of my lie, shaking so hard I could barely grasp the edge of the table. I had gained nothing and lost everything, exposed as the selfish participant I truly was. I drove away from the mall in a daze, the cold reality of OP's rejection settling over me. There was no going back, no saving the plan, and no way to maintain the Timothy identity. I realized I had to flee, not just from OP's anger, but from David's manipulation. I drove straight to Angelica's hotel room, seeking the only refuge I had left. Angelica Ruiz, my biological mother, opened the door and gasped when she saw my face. The carefully maintained composure she used to play the part of Timothy's traditional mother was gone. She saw Elijah broken and stripped of his desired family. I collapsed onto her bed, confessing everything. The marriage plan, the shocking half-sibling revelation, the confrontations. The words poured out raw and painful. I admitted the worst part. I had started developing genuine feelings for OP during the supervised visits, which only made the entire betrayal exponentially worse. Angelica sat beside me, her expression hardening from shock to a grim resolve. "I knew David was a liar 26 years ago," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "But this is monstrous." She realized the depth of the delusion, and how close we had come to committing an unspeakable act. She did not offer comfort. She offered an imperative. She demanded to know what I planned to do next. When I tried to rationalize that I just needed time, she cut me off. "You need professional help, Elijah. You need to stay far away from this family and your father. He used you, and you let him." She made it clear that my primary responsibility now was to leave and to address the psychological damage the scheme had inflicted. I looked at her, realizing she was right. I was broken, and the only hope for recovery was total severance from David's toxic world. I agreed to leave. Angelica immediately went online and bought me a plane ticket back to Wisconsin. The decision felt heavy, definitive, and profoundly sorrowful. I was abandoning the last fragile hope of family I had clung to. While Angelica was making arrangements, David called. His number flashed on my screen, a final connection to the nightmare I was escaping. I answered cautiously. He immediately launched into a frantic monologue, blaming OP for misunderstanding his complicated adult decisions and trying to convince me to return and help him spin a new version of the truth. "She's having a breakdown," he insisted. "If we stick together, we can still stabilize this, Timothy." The sheer audacity of his denial, even after being fully exposed, was astounding. It gave me the strength to finally stand up to him, to choose my own mental health over his acceptance. "Stop calling me Timothy," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "It's over, David. You ruined everything yourself. I'm leaving. I'm going back to Wisconsin, and I will not be a part of your life anymore." He sputtered, demanding to know what I was talking about, accusing me of betraying him. I didn't engage. I simply hung up, silencing the voice of the man who had created and sustained the lie. It was a profound act of defiance, the moment I finally chose myself over the father I had desperately wanted. Angelica looked at me, a flicker of pride replacing the exhaustion on her face. She drove me to the airport herself, watching until I disappeared through security, a man completely stripped of his identity and his purpose, but finally seeking a genuine escape. Back in Wisconsin, stripped of the identity of Timothy and the illusion of family, I started the difficult process of facing reality and seeking therapy. Meanwhile, the fallout I had caused continued to spread in the town I had fled. The day after I left, Angelica decided her silence could no longer be justified. She texted OP, hoping to explain her own complicity and shed light on David's control. OP agreed to meet Angelica at a public park, wary but needing answers. Angelica found OP sitting at a picnic table, and the two women, linked by the same deceitful man, began the painful conversation. Angelica confessed that she was sorry for every choice she had made, both 26 years ago during the affair and in the last year when she stayed silent about the courtship. "I didn't know the marriage was the actual plan until it was already happening," Angelica confessed, her voice thick with regret. She explained that David had promised her he would leave his wife back then, and when I was born, he chose to stay and raise his legitimate daughter, leaving me as his secret. She had raised me alone, consumed by guilt that I lacked a father figure. Angelica confirmed that she had threatened to expose David when I told her about the courtship, but I had begged her not to. I convinced her my only chance at a real family was through this scheme, and I had pressured her into silence. Now, she was making amends by giving OP the full, unvarnished story. She revealed the hidden financial details that OP and her mother were not yet aware of. David had been secretly sending thousands of dollars to me for years, money siphoned from the family business to support his secret life. He was not just a cheating husband. He was an embezzler who had built a foundation of financial deceit to sustain his facade. "Elijah is gone now. Elijah is gone now," Angelica told OP using my real name. "He is back here, and he is seeking therapy." He finally realized how sick the whole thing was. Angelica's confession provided the final, necessary pieces of the puzzle for OP, clarifying that David's manipulation was not a single, isolated incident, but a decades-long pattern of calculated betrayal. Later that same day, OP's uncle Francis, having fully grasped the devastating truth, began his damage control. He was utterly furious at his brother David for his selfish stupidity. Francis confronted David, and the fallout was immediate. David, still unable to grasp the severity of his actions, was forced to leave Francis's house. The revelation of the financial theft, confirmed by Angelica and then by Francis's investigation of the business records, was the ultimate catalyst for OP's mother. The adultery was one thing. The theft of $70,000, money that should have gone to their family, was a betrayal she could not forgive. This new financial information, shared between OP and her mother, solidified the mother's resolve, transforming her cold shock into firm, legal determination. The next step was inevitable: divorce. I was far away, but my mother's actions, finally speaking the truth, had inadvertently ensured that David would face total consequence. With Angelica having provided the final pieces of information, the Caldwell family was irrevocably broken. The last vestiges of the Timothy persona dissolved into the painful silence of my new, isolated life in Wisconsin. David Caldwell faced immediate and total consequence. His wife, the mother, filed for divorce on Monday morning, armed with evidence of his infidelity, his near-incestuous deceit, and the financial theft Francis had uncovered. David was officially separated from his family and eventually forced to move out of Francis's house as well, losing his business partnership and his carefully constructed public life. The perfect patriarch was exposed as nothing more than a selfish, calculating man. Back in his town, OP embraced her newfound independence. The canceled engagement and the exposure of the truth, though devastating, had freed her from the oppressive rules that had defined her existence. She began to build a life that was truly her own, one unburdened by the need for her father's approval. She learned to trust her own instincts, rejecting the tradition that had made her so vulnerable to manipulation. For me, Elijah, the road was long. I was in therapy, finally confronting the deep-seated abandonment issues that had driven me to participate in the appalling scheme. I was learning that gaining a family through deceit was not a resolution, but a new form of abuse. The stability I craved had to come from within. I was finally shedding the desperation that had nearly cost me everything. The ending was satisfying, though far from neat. David was alone and facing severe repercussions. OP was rebuilding her life with courage, and I, the desperate son who became the accomplice, was slowly, cautiously beginning to heal. My emotional arc was one of earned independence. I had avoided emotional messiness for so long, and now, finally broken by it, I had the chance to build a genuine, honest life.